We continue with our valuation model on Infosys, and in this particular section, we're going to now try and build the cost drivers for Infosys in this valuation model, right? So when we look at the cost drivers, we are primarily looking at a certain kind of costs that are there. What we'll do is, just as a matter of procedure and to make things simple, we're going to bring all the headers from the P&L to the assumption sheet. So I'm going to copy all this and I'm going to paste all this here, right? So we have all the major cost headers that are available, and we can put in those here. I will just increase the font here, and INR crore is what the values would be. So we are just going to kind of plug in these numbers for the last few years from the P&L and put them here, right? And we format these. Now it's up to us to figure out exactly as to which of these would depend on what kind of drivers. As we kind of look at this data, it is an important idea to figure out which is the biggest salary, which is the biggest cost header, which we find as salaries here. Salaries actually accounts for more than 60 to 70% of the cost overall. Total cost is about, for example, in the final year, about 45,000 crore, out of which 34,000 crore is only salaries expense. That's nearly 75% of the overall cost. Now, what does salary depend on? Salary depends on the number of employees. So let's first do a measurement on salary cost per employee, correct? It should depend on an employee basis. So this is the total salary cost multiplied by 10 raised to power 7 to convert it to rupees, and we divide it by the average number of employees during that year, right? Now that for the first year is not available, so I'm going to just plug in this number. It might give an error. We can go to this average formula and just do an average here. So we do get some number here, right? This is not an exact number because we have taken the average of 2012 and the previous year, but the previous year is not available. So it's going to give only the 2012 number. This is what broadly gives us the overall salary cost per employee on average, right? So this is, we can also say, average salary cost per employee, right? We can also look at change in average salary. Now, how do I calculate change? I take the current value, divide by the previous value minus 1. That tells us a few interesting things. Salaries suddenly jumped up in two of the years, and then started declining in one of the years, and then has been steady in the recent year, right? So that's the movement in the salary cost over the past few years that we have seen. And just because it's a percentage, I'll probably color it differently. That's the header in terms of salary cost per employee. Now we may want to try and find out how did salaries increase big time here, and why did it not increase this year? What was the lever that the company had used when they were kind of playing around this data in terms of trying to figure out as to what has happened to the salary in the past, right? Rest of the headers are not very big. So what we are going to try and do is we're going to take all these headers here, and just so that everything appears to be of the same font size, I'm going to put this all at 10 or maybe at 9 and find this out. Now this we're going to look at as percentage of revenue, right? Let's try and find all these as percentages of revenue. And if the company typically ensures that some of these headers are kind of passed on in terms of what is the percentage of revenue that you're looking at, then there should be a trend visible here, right? So if the company says that, whatever the travel expense is, it has to be a certain percentage of revenue, how do you decide what kind of expense you will take in travel expenses, right? So if you budget it for next year, there must be some yardstick, correct? Let's try and find out if these numbers are some measure of the revenue. So we divide this by the revenue for the year, which should be here, right? I will again have to plug in the revenue for this year. We don't have the data here. So let's put in the data here and we get this data, and that's about 2.3%, right? In this formula, we're going to freeze the revenue cell, freeze the row, but not the column, because when we drag it on the right side, we want it to move. When we drag it down, we don't want it to change, right? Now we will note that there are some trends available here. So if you look at the second one, which is travel expenses as percentage of sales, the average is about 3.5 and it's always centered around that number. So it's not significantly different from 3.5%. If you look at the third one, which is software packages, that's about 2% of revenue. If you look at communication expenses, that's about 0.8, 0.9% of revenue. If you look at this one, this professional charges are about 1.1, 1.2% of revenue. And other expenses went up for 2 years in between, but has again come back down to 4.2. So the average is about 4.5%. These look to be centered around an average. These five headers, they're all centered around an average and they're fairly stable. It's not like one of these numbers is significantly higher or lower than the other numbers. Technical subcontractors, on the other hand, there is a clear uptrend that is visible. So I can actually mention it here. It looks like an uptrend. Everything else is stable. Correct? I'm just mentioning this for our understanding. This does not need to be here, but one of them is an uptrend, which probably means that they are using more of technical subcontractors as it goes along. But rest of it is primarily kind of fixed as a percentage of sales, right? It's all stable as a percentage of sales. So we do need to find out what is causing this uptrend. Why this uptrend, right? So we'll try and find that answer. Let's just park the question for now as to why is this uptrend going to be there. We have a couple of questions that we need to try and find answers to. The first one is, why did this happen and then this happen? The rate going up by 20%, salary cost going up by 23%, 20% for 2 years, and then a dip in the third year, right? And the next question is, why is this uptrend playing out in technical subcontractors? So under the cost drivers itself, we have two broad sets of discussions that we have to kind of look at, which is basically on these headers. And we'll try and identify those responses. We'll try and find out those responses as we go along, right? The next set of costs that you see on the P&L would include things around depreciation. Now, depreciation is going to get projected once we kind of have a capex schedule. And so we're going to park that for the time being aside. There's no interest. The next header is taxes. So what kind of taxes play out? So on the assumption sheet, we can put something called as effective tax rate. And how do I calculate effective tax rate? That's tax divided by PBIT, or profit before tax. PBT. So profit before tax is what we're going to calculate, right? So we go to the P&L sheet, we take the tax and we just divide this by the profit before tax, and we find the percentage, which is about 29%, 28%, and we look at that hovering around 27, 28% all the years, right? It's slightly lower than the usual corporate tax rate, because possibly some of these IT companies get a little bit of a benefit in terms of where they are working out of. So some of their facilities may be paying lower taxes, right? It's a possibility. So that's possibly why the effective tax rate is lower. Now, all we need to do is basically, once we project the number of employees for the next year, right? If we are able to project the number of employees for the next year, we can basically just go ahead and calculate this set of data and work along with it, right? So that's basically the overall header or number that we see in terms of our discussion, and we look and play at those numbers, right? So that's in a nutshell the discussion that we have had for the cost drivers. When we look in the sheet up, we also seem to have made a small error here, which is in the support and sales number of employees. We had copied this from the investor sheet of Infosys, and what we, while copying it, probably didn't realize is that there are cells in between which give data about quarterly numbers, right? So we probably need to plug in the data from here again. And so that's 713483887904 kind of number. So we put in 713483887904. Then we look at what's the other number, 8422 and 9811. So we put in 8422 and 9811. That's the set of data that we get. We can remove all these data points which have been copied here. Slight change in the metrics after that, what we get, but rest of it kind of stays consistent. Very mild change in the numbers of revenue creation that we might see. No change in the cost headers because of this change. So that's a small mistake that we have kind of corrected here. And what that does is it brings us to a point where we broadly have our revenue and cost drivers in place. Once we project the number of employees for the next year, it should be a straightforward calculation beyond that in terms of what kind of revenues have to come in subsequent years, right? So that's it in the cost drivers bit. We will continue with the balance sheet drivers in our next section.